I need to do a quick video looking into factors that helped ZANU-PF retain power and lead a one-party dominant state. In Zimbabwe and the ZANU-PF's case, the process of centralizing power took place in stop-start phases. First, there was the period 1980 to 1987, leading to the 1987 Pact of Unity, after which ZAP was absorbed within ZANU-PF. The one-party phase dominated the political scene until 1999. A period ended by the emergence of the Movement for Democratic Change. In the third phase, post-2000, ZANU-PF maintained its dominance by restructuring state power and attempting to manipulate the constitution and the electoral process until the global political agreement of September 2008. The government of national unity was finally implemented in February 2009 with a 24-month time frame to agree a new constitution. So it can be said that we are now witnessing another fourth phase of significant transition. So it can be said that we are now witnessing another fourth phase of significant transition. The crisis in Zimbabwe is systematic. The crisis is systematic. And the literature on this is so enormous, so huge. There's a plethora of books written on the literature on this systematic crisis in Zimbabwe. And it is multi-layered and multi-faceted. In addition, it has played out and is playing out in multiple ways. This was said by Raftopoulos in his own words. Raftopoulos said, confrontations over land and property rights, contestations over the history and meanings of land and citizenship, the emergence of critical civil society groupings campaigning around trade unions, human rights and constitutional questions, the restructuring of the state in more authoritarian forms and its resistance, the broad pan-African and anti-imperialist meanings of the struggle in Zimbabwe and the central role of Robert Gabriel Mugabe. What was the central role for Mugabe and his political skills? If you read London Times, I think there's an article written by Richard Dorden, a long-standing correspondent and editor for Africa. And now he was the chairman of the Royal African Society, I think, was one of the first to call publicly for discussions with Mugabe in 2005. As Dorden pointed out, in Africa, politics is personal. He pointed out that in Africa, politics is personal. And the calculations of what is rational in African contexts may not be deemed equally rational in a Western political context. There is certainly the question of Mugabe's supreme political skills, his ability as an orator and communicator, and his charismatic leadership. We may find it extraordinary, but the old man was or is still held in great affection by elements of the Zimbabwean population. In 2008, you remember, in March election, ZANU-PF received approximately 40% of the vote. And the Mugabe's leadership of ZANU-PF retains a degree of ideologically popular support. The size of the vote is not solely down to intimidation. Furthermore, Mugabe's rhetoric, in particular his defiance of Britain, the former colonial power, it struck chords among other constituencies across Africa. There was also the question of affinity of interest and outlook between ZANU-PF Politburo hardliners, other senior ZANU-PF leaders, and Mugabe. This was based on a combination of shared ideology, although political observers have commented that only Mugabe believed in the Marxist rhetoric, shared particular generational experience and outlook. Calculations of self-interest were also part of the equation. A web of patronage and privileged access emerged, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, that the fusion of ZANU-PF and the Zimbabwean state has been able to confer. This operated both at the top level among senior officials as well as the grassroots in the form of access to the state benefit system of food. This process was a direct product and a substitute of the erosion of broader political support for ZANU-PF in the 1990s. Growing dissent from organized labor, civil society, student and youth groups, as well as within the business community and the civil service, led Mugabe and the ZANU-PF leadership in the Politburo to search for alternative sources of support. The rising political and social discontent in the 90s was not simply a product of ZANU-PF's poor policies, no? Unemployment and rising. It was matched by social grievances from other sectors of society, including war veterans, they had grievances, landless rural populations had grievances, politically vulnerable because of the rising economic problems associated with the ISAP. You remember the economic structural adjustment program initiated by 𝐏𝐨𝐥𝐢𝐭𝐢𝐜, I think. Mugabe offered first generous pensions, then learned to appease these aggrieved constituencies. He gave land to the war veterans because of the grievances that they were facing, and he had to give them generous pensions. You remember the monies these guys were using to buy cabbages, filling the bus stops with cabbages for their cattle in the rural areas. They got around 50,000. Those were generous pensions that were given to the war veterans by Mugabe, and to try to appease their grievances. Through his astute manipulation of the constitution, use of patronage, exploitation of legitimate grievances, and the political antenna for populist politics, Mugabe proved a political phenomenon. His studied alliance with the war veterans from 1999 marked a power shift within ZANU-PF. So the use and abuses of history. The presentation of history has been critical to survival of the ZANU-PF one-party state, particularly from 2000 to 2005. But this manipulation of the national story was not new. The party has long sought to present a triumphant or a victorious single-minded narrative. But ZANU or ZANLA has never comprised a monolithic block seen in the fractious history of the civilian insurrection in the 1970s. Its experiences in Mozambique and the party and its military wings' relationship with its rural peasant constituents. Similarly, the role of history proved a key element of identity and validation in the 1980s. The creation of national heroes and the destruction of colonial ones was seen as a crucial early part of constructing a national identity in the first decade of independence. Given the recent war, in which 30 to 80,000 people had died, it was understandable why the Mugabe government used this source of national legitimacy. It was an important emotional symbol and the source of legitimacy, as both Ndebele and Shona-speaking communities had participated in the liberation movements. The idea of designated national heroes was a powerful source of potential national unity, but one that proved controversial. Who should be deemed a national hero? Should it be the living or the dead? The politicians or the liberation fighters? Should the ex-combatants be involved? And were some heroes more important than others? Or were all equal? So, although the ideal in the ZANU-PF government rhetoric was participation and equality, the reality proved rather different. It revealed a huge disparity between the government and those governed. Politicians and ex-combatants. There was a huge difference here. There was a disparity between the government and the governed. Politicians and ex-combatants. Therefore, the self-conscious effect of the government to create national unity and political legitimacy and identity had acquired the opposite effect. There were other less public ways in which history was distorted or reconstructed. in this first decade. In reality, the manner of victory was not a truth of armed struggle, but instead, it was a product of a negotiated settlement under enormous international pressure. So the Lancaster House settlement represented a constitutional compromise under the guise of liberation victory. The myth and narrative of land, one of the key national grievances, which had proved so potent in the liberation struggle, was not firmly and openly addressed. Although all parties and interested observers, the British, Zimbabwean, American, Mozambicans, South Africans, and the Commonwealth, clearly appreciated its significance. Similarly, the place of history on the national curriculum itself should be considered. The writing of standard textbooks emphasized the contribution of ZANU and ZANLA to the liberation victory, and either downplayed or airbrushed out other players. We had players ZAPU and ZIPRA and non-Marxist nationalist movements. So from the late 90s, patriotic history appeared as a direct product of the emerging alliance between ZANU-PF and the war veterans. This narrative, particularly after 2000, drew upon wider society and the astute use of state control of the media. This repackaging of history and its use and distortion of legitimate grievances contributed to patriotic blackness. In contrast to the patriotic whiteness of the Rhodesian Front era of 1965 to 1980, and an exclusive version of national identity, the party conscripted elements of history which it believed would generate support and undermine opposition. Themes and events which did not serve ZANU-PF's agenda were downplayed and misrepresented. The dominant narrative was ZANU-PF as the sole champion, past and present, of the independence and sovereignty of Zimbabwe, under constant attack from imperialist forces. This was a dominant narrative for Zimbabweans to believe. Because remember, there was this use of state media to make sure that they push this narrative of being under attack from the imperialist forces. They were saying their independence and their sovereignty was under attack from these imperial forces. This construction of history tapped existing grievances and beliefs. It resonated in strong feelings about colonialism and the perceptions of Western hypocrites about human rights. Inequality of land ownership was key to the story. Land hunger and dispossession was plain for all to see, which strengthened the plausibility of the narrative. And this made patriotic history very difficult to challenge. Very, very difficult to challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, a wide spectrum of Zimbabwe intellectuals was involved in the elaboration and the presentation of this patriotic history. This legitimized the persecution of opponents who were labeled sellouts, a hugely derogative and a very dangerous term, dating from the liberation struggle and radically altered political debate. Political activity outside ZANU-PF orthodox was illegitimate. It involved a sophisticated strategy in the state-sponsored media, the Herald, ZBC, and other state-sponsored media, which had assumed a greater importance with the progressive government legislation and the repression of the independent media. Importantly, in the rural areas, the Zimbabwean Broadcasting Corporation, ZBC, or Zimbabwean television were the principal source of outside information in the news. This is why Zimbabwe maintained only one state radio, only one state television. What was this history that Zimbabwe elites went to such pains to create? It's a created history, it's not reality. It overlooked or ignored important events. The tensions within ZANU and ZANLA in the 70s, the page of short-lived Zimbabwe Independence People's Army, ZIPA, and the brutalization of young and the more junior ZANLA cadres. The use of violence against sellouts in the rural communities, in the liberation war, the ferocity of the 𝐏𝐸𝐸 campaign of 1982 to 1985, in which between 20 to 30,000 people were killed. Crucially, whites were cast as the scapegoats, and the conspiracy theories multiplied. Patriotic history successfully combined the potent narratives of land and race and external imperialist enemies. However, this patriotic history was not confined to the land question. ZANU-PF's victory narrative represented itself as part of a long narrative of Pan-Africanism and anti-colonialism. Sovereignty was of key importance, the converse of colonialism. EU, European Union, nominal sanctions after 2003 became the main explanation for Zimbabwe's economic difficulties, rather than ZANU-PF's increasingly disastrous monetary and fiscal policies, and were consistently portrayed as external. Subtext: unwarranted imperialist interference. Critics or opponents of this version of history underestimated or misunderstood it. Critics or opponents of this version of history, they underestimated or they misunderstood its appeal disastrously. They also failed to articulate an alternative. To a degree, they were also naive in not understanding the narrative attractiveness to wider Zimbabwean society, and did not appreciate how their own use of words such as international community and regime change had very negative connotations, as the inheritance of the anti-colonial struggle was also embedded within the trade union movement and wider Zimbabwean civil society. Patriotic history's anti-colonial rhetoric had an appeal outside the relatively narrow constituents of dispossessed rural communities of land question. The quality and organization of ZANU-PF opponents, looking at those opponents, the quality and organization of ZANU-PF opponents. The survival of ZANU-PF is also associated with the lack of determined opposition leadership. The absence of a robust opposition was itself shaped by the violence of 1977-1979 experience in the Zimbabwean rural districts of Mashonaland and Manicaland, and subsequently 1983 to 1987 in Matabeleland. There was too much violence. A genuine democratic and social challenge to ZANU-PF only emerged in late 1990s as the product of wider civil and social discontent. By the mid-1990s, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, ZCTU, was able to overcome long-standing structural problems, including slow rates of union recruitment, non-payment of dues, and poor communications between central and regional organizations. Though the formation of a wider civil alliance pressing for political reforms and constitutional change, the National Constitutional Assembly was formed. The National Constitutional Assembly was a wider alliance formed to press for political reform and constitutional change in our country. This intensification of pressure on the state led to the formation of the Movement for Democratic Change in 1999. I know a lot of people do not understand this history, that in the mid or late 1990s, ZCTU was able to overcome long-standing structural problems. These included slow rates of union recruitment, non-payment of dues, and the poor communications between central and regional organizations. Through the formation of a wider civic alliance pressing for political reform and constitutional change, the NCA. This increased pressure or intensification of pressure on the state led to the formation of the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, in 1999. In part, this can be seen as a continuation or a continuum in Zimbabwe's long history of tension between labor and the nationalistic politics dating back to the 1950s, 1960s. As the NCA developed its own community outreach programs, a lively political space for debate opened, and the NCA received support in the rural areas from white farmers. This produced a broad coalition of interest groups, a genuine multiracial cross-class alliance challenging the ZANU-PF, with a democratization agenda. This rival political movement was also matched by emerging tensions and discussion within ZANU-PF in the 1990s. Itself, the product of a combination of parliamentarians pressing for reform and in some cases for a change of leadership. The upshot was the constitutional referendum of February 2000 became a referendum on ZANU-PF rule and Robert Mugabe's leadership. The violence. Yay. The continuation of ZANU-PF as a dominant one-party state was, of course, also been intimately connected to the reorganization of state structures and the role of violence and intimidation. First, there was the aspect of legacy of the colonial white settler. The incoming ZANU-PF government in 1980 did not just inherit the political economy of the white settler. No. They did not just inherit the economy of the white settler state. No. It inherited the power of the colonial state, the monopoly of the use of force, and so its security, executive, and legislative capacity. It also inherited well-established, particularly effective organizational structures of surveillance and control. The Central Intelligence Organization and the Special Branch or CID within the British South African Police, which was reconstituted as Zimbabwe Republic Police. It is a BSAP. Zimbabwe ZRP, BSAP reconstituted to ZRP, but they inherited their special branches, the CIDs, the CIOs. Furthermore, there was this legacy of the colonial state using asymmetric and disproportionate force when dealing with the opposition and dissent voices. The ZANU-PF government inherited the settler status authoritarian political culture, in other words. In the 1980s, there was a marked failure to reform or democratize the traditional structures of power in the rural areas. Indeed, there was a concerted effort to replace the experiment of democratization of local rural organizations. Within ZANU-PF affiliates as regional chiefs and headmen, they were affiliates of ZANU-PF. They become affiliates of ZANU-PF. Do you know what this means? It meant another ZANU-PF grassroots network for the party. It was a continuation of the authoritarian, bifurcated state. The repressive state was again plain to see in the organization of state structures from 2000. And repressive legislation in form of the POSA, or Public Order and Security Act, and Access to Information Act of 2002. POSA was of 2000, this was of 2002. This emergence legislation and crackdown on the independent media had unsettled echoes of the UDI era. Formal legislation was matched by pressure on Supreme Court and High Court judges to resign. State refusal to comply with court judgments and amnesties were given to people who had committed acts of violence on behalf of ZANU-PF. When taken to court, courts gave judgments. The Supreme Court judges and the High Court judges, they gave judgments, which ZANU-PF refused to comply with, leading to the expelling or resignation of those judges. That was first. Second, violence, as we all know in Zimbabwe, is part of the political culture of ZANU-PF. This dates back to the Liberation War era. There's the place of violence in ZANU-PF's own thinking. From Robert Mugabe to Emmerson Mnangagwa, both they gauchely joke that they have got degrees of violence. In Mugabe, a reference to his 18 other honorary doctorates, he had a degree of violence. In Emmerson Mnangagwa, he has got a dozen of honorary doctorates conferred by partisan universities. He added this degree of violence. You heard him saying, we are the police, we are the army, we are the what? After losing 2008 elections, he said, Mugabe, you won't go. They were now utilizing their degrees of violence, their doctorates of violence. Mugabe was one of the first Zimbabwe nationalists to advocate the turn to armed struggle in the early 60s in ZAPU. That was before ZANU and ZAPU split in 1963. He was confident in the ultimate military victory in 1979. A confidence which was not necessarily shared by other ZANU leading military commanders. I have maintained time and again that, ladies and gentlemen, let's engage ZANU-PF militarily. Because some of you people can't see what I see after a short period of time. When Mugabe advocated for military action against Ian Smith, those leading military commanders in ZANU did not foresee victory coming soon. But Mugabe was confident that after a certain period of time, the victory eventually come. It is not simply a question of attitudes of the efficacy and the place of violence. There are structural factors, ladies and gentlemen, which explain the enduring culture of political violence within ZANU-PF. These may include in the alliance between the army and the party that emerged in the 70s. As has been said, the experience of ZANU cadres in the Liberation War was brutalization to enforce solidarity and discipline. During the Liberation War, the use and rage of violence to intimidate Shona-speaking ethnic groups inside Rhodesia was deliberately systematic and extreme, to the extent that it constituted a political language. Post-independence state-directed violence in the continuing civil war in Matabeleland against the Ndebele people and the Kalanga people. This did not provoke criticism or comment from the international community, since Zimbabwe was needed as an international success story in the larger struggle against apartheid in South Africa. This is why they couldn't even recognize the killing and butchering of the Ndeveles and Kalangas as genocide. The use of violence from the late 90s onwards was substitute for a direct reflection of the failed nation-building project associated with the gathering crisis. Faced with the social and political consequences of the accelerating and precipitous decline of the economy, the sharp contraction of agricultural and industrial productivity, the progressive formalization of labor, the informal dollarization of finance transactions, and the massive internal displacement and economic and political migration, the state responded with proven techniques to quell open and suspected dissent. Remember, we had Nasan Samuel from ZANU-PF who stated that the area of violence is an area where ZANU-PF has a very strong, long, and successful history. There was a draconian response to food riots in 1998 in response to the sharp rise in the prices of maize. 10 people were shot and killed, and hundreds were injured. The 2000 constitutional referendum result prompted Mugabe to look to the radical constituents of the war veterans. They become a substitute to the loss of political support from both MDC and dissatisfied ZANU-PF supporters. Farm invasions during that time were legitimized by the state. And for war veterans, they took over the fast-track land reform process, replacing local development committees. Violence against political opponents and internal sellouts spiraled, most markedly in 2002, 2005, 2007, 2008. Again, at local level, government officials, teachers, healthcare workers were all dismissed if they were thought being sympathetic to the opposition, leading to an evisceration of bureaucrats and the civil service in the districts. There was also the violence and upheaval associated with Operation Murambatsvina in 2005. The subsequent UN report estimated that 700,000 people had been affected with a disastrous loss of livelihood. Again, in some recent, there has been a systematic use of violence, particularly in March 2007 and in the 2000 run-up to the aftermath of the elections, referred to as the fear, and again now in ZANU-PF heartlands, in Marsh East, Marsh Central, Manicaland, Marsh West. What is notable about the use of violence is its targeted and specific nature in the run-up to the elections. This is the notable use of violence. Once election monitors are in place, elections themselves have been conducted according to Zimbabwe election regulations, indicating that despite politicization at the top, the lower levels of ZEG are scrupulous and professional in the execution of their duties. This was then. The sources of violence were varied within the structure and organization of ZANU-PF as a political movement. One of the key players is ZANU-PF youth militia. As Kenya's former anti-corruption Tsar, John Gitong, has pointed out in a different context in Kenya, violence is empowering. Here in Zimbabwe, youth violence has been co-opted, licensed, and encouraged by the party core state. In the formation of, it was done in the formation of the Green Bombers. The particular Zimbabwean political culture of T-shirts, which confer identity and affiliation, communicate and intimidate, plays out here too. Other perpetrators and cohesive support from the state was and is crucial. Other perpetrators were war veterans, ZANU-PF supporters, and mixed groups. Organizational, logistical, cohesive support from the state was crucial at this point. A pattern appeared of grassroots initiatives and centralized violence and cohesion, with the collaboration and other violent acts from elements within the ZRP, particularly the plain-clothed ones, the uniformed ones, and the riot ones. The CID, the CIO, the Zimbabwe National Army elements. This activity was sanctioned by the president, was sanctioned also by the commander-in-chief, the president who was the commander-in-chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, but who consistently told listeners in intimate conversations that he does not know the extent of what is going on in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, how far is ZANU-PF adapting to democratic politics? ZANU. What is true is that we must move away from simple binary models of ZANU-PF and MDC. The political reality has shifted markedly from 2008 and is now very different in 2011, 2018, 2023 in a number of crucial ways. The first crucial way is that ZANU-PF has adapted to democratic politics by participating in a coalition government. Implementation remains imperfect and very divisive over the questions of the finance and judicial portfolios, foreign radio stations, and the appointment of provincial governors and ambassadors. Full and immediate implementation of the GPA, which is Global Political Agreement, for ZANU-PF would, however, have meant carving its own tombstone, since it would mean relinquishing key levers of power over the state. Therefore, the battle for the state, as already noted, is an ongoing thing. Until today, the global political agreement power has not been implemented. At the same time, new civic and business leaders have emerged. This is manifested in the recent meeting of civic business leaders and the SADC Secretary General in Botswana, where they presented the case for postponing currently proposed elections in June 2011 because of anticipated political instability and violence and the knock-on effect on economic activity. Single issue determined independent organization. A good example were the 𝐏𝐸𝐻𝐸, which remained active. So this was then in 2011 where they were proposing to ensure that those elections were postponed. The third debate within ZANU-PF about the succession, it was about the succession and the need for economic and political reform, which continued in private and is articulated to MDC politicians as well, as noted by Eddie Cross. But the ZBC and TV maintained a strict public ZANU-PF line. The question of succession was enormously divisive. Mugabe continued resolutely to refuse to nominate a successor. There had been repeated press reports since 2008 that the commanders of Zimbabwe's joint forces have confronted Mugabe about his succession plans. The ZANU-PF 11, the party conference was scheduled for December 2010 and was ostensibly held in closed session. Although the public face was one of unit, it was strongly suspected that there was an enormously acrimonious debate behind the scenes. It was likely that Mugabe would have confirmed as the head of Zimbabwe to take the party into the following year's anticipated elections, because the old man wants it. However, Mugabe was increasingly unwell, and he knew it. There was jockeying for positions as usual suspects. There was Vice President Joyce Mjuru, and there was Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was the defense minister then. With those links with the army, Mnangagwa himself had declared ZANU-PF would not hand over power to the MDC in an election, as it would be tantamount to failing department comrades of the 70s War of Independence. So in the same speech, MDC was also accused of doing the bidding of hostile Western countries and labeled a puppet political party. The most pessimistic of knowledge, Zimbabwe journalists, observers in London predicted a civil war with the ZANU-PF following Mugabe's inevitable death, and that the army will step in. The ZANU-PF itself was divided about the wisdom of elections. The hardliners who had consistently tried to wreck the GPA since its creation wanted to end the arrangement and to hold elections in June. The charges against continued cooperation remained sanctions. Foreign radio stations on which MDC cannot deliver, contestation over the governor of the Reserve Bank, the Attorney General appointment of provincial governors and ambassadors, and the claimed loss of sovereignty through the dollarization of the economy. Others within the Politburo and the party were rightly fearful that ZANU-PF would lose, and were therefore keen to either delay elections or to prolong the coalition. Remember, the coalition, the government of national unity. Having said that, ZANU-PF was preparing for democratic politics through the reorganization of its party structure. Although in the run-up to the last elections, the previous elections in 2008, ZANU-PF was relatively poor organized and underfunded. It seemed that the party had been swifter to begin addressing those failings that MCD functions. However, attitudes within ZANU-PF to elections were still fractious and contested. Funding is more problematic now that the economic ministries are in MDC ministers' hands, making access to state funds more difficult for ZANU-PF. Preparation of campaign rhetoric, indigenization and empowerment as the latest anti-imperialist watchwords feature in speeches and state media. There was a recognition that their former ZANU-PF strongholds, such as Masvingo, the Midlands and Manicaland, have dwindled, and that the vote in Mashonaland cannot be banked on. Because of the constituents map, the majority of constituencies were in the rural areas, which also explains the concentration of preparatory violence which was already in play, breaking up meetings and constitutional outreach and instances of violence in Mashonaland, Eastern Central, and Manicaland. Violence, intimidation, hate speeches, and abductions were increased significantly, along with the denial of freedom of speech. In November, ZANU-PF was judged responsible for 99.1% of all breaches of the GPA, 40.6% of those breaches due with attempts to control and manipulate the election process through manipulating of preventing voter registration. Operating headless chickens has been launched by ZANU-PF activists to intimidate former ZANU-PF and MDC supporters in the Mount Darwin area. In Manicaland, freelance journalists have been arrested. Finally, the army, particularly the Joint Operation Command, appeared to remain crucial as power brokers and kingmakers. The non-political army formed with the fusion of three forces, imagine. The ZRNA, the ZANLA, and the ZIPRA, under British military mission after 1980, has now evolved to the point that its upper leadership was now all ex-ZANLAs. There has been a progressive politicization of the army since 2000, together with the internal tensions and friction within the security forces, caused by varying willingness to use state-sanctioned violence, which was seen by some as eroding professionalism and morale. In parallel to the politicization of the army, there has been an accelerated militarization of the administration of the country. With the financial and economic build-down of the Zimbabwean economy and the flight of social economic groups that were the foundation of the modern Zimbabwe economy. Figures range from 3 to 3.5 million, approximately 1 million of whom live in Britain. There was a progressive process of the army stepping in to run the crumbling infrastructure of the country and the parastatal organizations. Between 2000 and 2008, military personnel were running the Grain Marketing Board, the National Railways of Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe Prison Services, the Zimbabwe Electricity Supply Water, and the ZINWA, and involved in organizing the elections. There were also generational factors at play within the Zimbabwe National Army, now the dominant security force within the country. It is gentocrats who are determined that, or who were determined that the young techs within the army and the police should remain subservient. The junior officers' allegiance was questionable. And if violence broke out, these junior officers would not have sided with the generals, as evidenced by incidents of indiscipline in army barracks. One of the recent crises during that time tipped points of the ZANU-PF regime came probably in July 2008, when junior police officers and army officers demonstrated against a lack of pay, and the state responded by typical asymmetric violence. Whether the army was gonna or will step in with another guardian corps, as it appeared to do in March and April 2008, to prevent the victory of mass mobilization and discontent manifest in MDC victory in the parliamentary and the presidential elections. This was debatable, ladies and gentlemen. What was certain was that there was continued joke pressure on Mugabe to appoint his successor. The WikiLeaks cables of 2007 indicated the army had been in private discussions with the reforming elements in ZANU-PF to ensure a transition to a young technocrat with a broader reform agenda, which would have the support of the army. Shows a consistent line of thinking. This was indicated in press reports in August 2008 that even General Valerio Swanda and the police commissioner then Chihuri were both letting it to be known that ZANU-PF should go into a coalition with the MDC. Swanda was reported as saying if the MDC pulled out, it would be a chaotic situation, which would make all of them vulnerable, and no African country would support a forceful seizure of power, especially if they know they had been working to destroy this African-initiated arrangement. There's been progress towards democratization and pluralism pluralism since 2008, with the broad support for not returning to the appalling conditions of 2008 and early 2009. There are other indications of progress. The official welcoming of serious researched histories of Zimbabwe by the MDC Minister of Education, Deft Coulthard, and the current review of the place and content of history on the national culture, the picture on land form and regeneration of the agriculture sector was good in parts. The then Finance Minister Tendai Biti statement to Parliament on the budget in 2010, in November 20, noted agriculture production was up by 19.3%, reflecting a more liberalized marketing environment and stable currencies. Short-term stabilization and modest economic revival has been achieved. Biti's commentary on 26 November predicted the economy would grow by 8.1% in 2010 and by 9.3% in 2011. Mineral earnings have increased by 47%, as has the budget for education, and a tax-free threshold has been established at 225 per month. Although this produced criticism from the likes of Wellington Chibebe of the ZCTU, the diaspora slowly returned, although the pattern from the UK was more maintaining a foot in both camps. Remittances remained key. So the purpose of the GPA has been problematic, but it is also cautiously successful. Its lifespan and therefore role has been contested. Is it to be a government of national unity looking to the long term, or an interim transitional arrangement overseeing the drafting of a new constitution and renewed multi-party election? A constitutional outreach program has been carried out, although 18 recent meetings were disrupted and it has been suspended due to lack of funding. Electoral registration, one of the keys to the distorted vote in 2008, remained problematic. Together with the issue of the vote of the diaspora, minor political parties have emerged, and here the importance of the GP to a wider political scene should have been noted, as it preludes the three coalition partners from election. Contests. Simba Makoni's centrist part, Mawambo Kusile Don, who challenge ZAPU's constituencies. There is tension within the MDCT on whether to continue and the discussion of the attractions or otherwise of an electoral pact with the MDCM. Observers have commented that MDC party functionaries have become so involved in current government structures that pulling out is much harder to do than staying in. There was the associated difficulty of explaining to outside supporters if the decision to pull out precipitates a return to the violence and disorder of 2008. Morgan Tsvangirai's political skills and the use of kitchen cabinet, whose own practical skills were not widely respected, were frequently questioned. In 2011, it was a perfect storm, repeating the disastrous events of 2000 with a constitutional referendum on the Kariba draft, the end of GPA, and the parliamentary elections in June. If an election is held, will it see removal of ZANU-PF at the ballot boxes? Yes. Will ZANU-PF see the power? No. As Mnangagwa said, if you don't vote for us in the next election, we will rule even if you don't want. The likely outcome is therefore rebooted coalition government, an MDC victory with an election pact or separately, with the support of the smaller parties ZAPU, MKD, but in coalition with the ZANU-PF. What is certain was that the GPA represented a continuing struggle for the state. This struggle was untied, messy, slow movements backwards and forwards. Sorry, guys. Forwards. So, to wind up this presentation, an hour or 5 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, there is no magic solution from the United Nations, the African Union, or SADC. The international community was very limited, has a very limited political leverage, and the sanctions were proving a sticky wish to beat Tsvangirai in the MDCT. Under President Thabo Mbeki, you remember, quiet diplomacy, South Africa was enormously instrumental in painstakingly persuading the warring factions of the need for compromise and political accommodation. Although Mbeki's more trenchant critics argued that the South African government was effectively prolonging the political life of ZANU-PF party state. Observers have argued South Africa's support for liberationist brotherhood, Liberation Brotherhood, from 2000 provided an important touchstone of support symbolically and psychologically for Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF. Within the organizational structures of SADC, sympathy for ZANU-PF at the ministerial council level, as well as lower bureaucratic level, has helped to ensure that the MDC functions approaches were smoothed or blocked, as issues were neither brought to nor raised at the ministerial level. The South African president was rightly castigated for not speaking out more loudly on SADC's damning report on election abuses in 2002. But both Mbeki and his successor Jacob Zuma clearly see South Africa can only exert limited pressure. SADC or South Africa military intervention is simply out of the question. Given the Sandifi's debilitated military capacity, South Africa was not the sole source of Zimbabwe energy supplies, and with the progressive implosion of the Zimbabwe economy, the threat of trade sanctions was also nullified. Indeed, it was in Pretoria's interest to minimize the Zimbabwe meltdown because of the associated massive migrant problem which exacerbated South Africa's own socio-economic and security problems, such as Rhodesia did in the UDI era. The Zimbabwe question has provoked toxic for the entire region. It has proved toxic for the entire region. Before, South Africa was critical in pressurizing the Ian Smith government to come to terms. Now, however, the outcome will be decided within Zimbabwe. So, for the benefit of doubt, ladies and gentlemen, CID means Criminal Investigation Department. CIO means Central Intelligence Organization. GNU means Government of National Unit. JOC means Joint Operations Command. MDCM, Movement for Democratic Change, led by Mtambara. MDCT, Movement for Democratic Change, led by Tsvangirai. MKD, Mavambo Kusile Dawn, a part led by Simba Makon. SADC SADC, Southern African Development Community. SANDF, South African National Defense Forces. WOZA, Women of Zimbabwe Association. ZANLA, Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army. ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union, ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZBC, Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, ZCTU, Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, ZIPA, Zimbabwe Independent People's Army, ZIPRA, Zimbabwe Independent People's Revolutionary Army, ZRNA, Zimbabwe Rhodesia National Army, ZNA, Zimbabwe National Army, ZRP, Zimbabwe Republic Police, ZTV, Zimbabwe Television. And that was the end of this presentation. Good night.